Okay, so I think we can all relate to this, but buying yarn isn't as simple as just buying yarn anymore. It's so much more complicated, especially with the rise in social media and fear mongering on the internet in general, and the ability to shame people without having to talk to them face to face. It's a lot. So in this video, I'm not going to be talking about what yarns to buy versus not to buy, and I'm going to try to keep my opinions to a minimum, although they will seep through at some points, you'll see. My only intention here is to create sort of a roundup of some of the ethical and moral questions being raised in the fiber arts community and putting them into like just a central location of this video, because I feel like there are so many opinions just all over the place, and I personally just wanted to explore all of them, and that's what we're gonna do. This is a video where I'm gonna expect a pretty active comment section, and I'm looking forward to that because I'm gonna miss stuff, and it's not a 5-hour video, so I'm not diving into the details on everything. Now, a little bit of my resume so you know where I'm coming from and what lens I'm looking through. I've been knitting since I was in elementary school. I learned to crochet when I was early in high school. I graduated from a high school that focused on environmentalism and sustainability through the curriculum of all of its classes. And I graduated with an engineering degree with a lot of focus in material science and especially polymer science. So again, I'm just letting you know that because I want you to know what lens I'm looking through and what biases I'm walking into this conversation with. Just when I gotta get up, huh? Also, my name is Isabella, this is Pippin, and that's Mary. Because this is the kind of conversation that could go on forever, I am limiting myself to 7 different categories. Those categories being sustainability, animal rights, ethical labor practices, local sourcing, personal finance, accessibility, and stash size. And like I said, the intention is just for me to cover what are the conversations going on right now? What are people saying? Oh, just a quick note that for a lot of these categories, they get shorter as I go on. So I'm going to start out with some of the beefier categories. So if you're watching this and you're like, oh my gosh, she's 20 minutes in and I've only covered 2 categories, some of the later ones go by pretty quickly. Sustainability is our first one, and it's a big one. I'm going to go through the 10 most commonly used yarns in the fiber arts community and touch on the environmental considerations and impact of each yarn from a high level, with the understanding that yarn can vary greatly from brand to brand. For example, cotton yarn from one brand looks very different than cotton yarn from another brand. It's not exactly comparable, and so for the sake of the video, there will be some generalizations made, and just keep that in mind. Oh, and a band-aid to rip off early is no yarn is good for the environment. Everything has an environmental impact. Let's talk yarn types. I'm going to start out with synthetic yarn, only because that's the most controversial. I think a lot of people talk about acrylic yarn, and it's not just acrylic yarn in the world of synthetic yarns. You're probably going to hear a lot of different names thrown around in synthetic yarn world, like acrylic, polyamide, nylon. There are lots of different plastics that go into yarn, so it's not just acrylic. So synthetic yarn in general, some of the environmental considerations that go into that is it's a petroleum-based material, and so it's being derived from a non-renewable resource. It doesn't biodegrade, and it's typically very difficult to recycle. And that's based purely on the chemical properties of the polymers themselves and certain limitations in the world of recycling. I could make a whole video just on recycling and how it works, because it's a lot more involved than a lot of people think, but that's not what this is about. And then the last big environmental consideration with synthetic yarns is that they do produce microplastics, especially when they're washed. Microplastics have become kind of a really big buzzword in the world of sustainability, and a lot of people might not know why. So one of the largest concerns with microplastic, outside of just pollution in general is bad, is microplastics get consumed by animals, including humans, and has been shown in a lot of studies to potentially lead to cancer or other specific health risks associated with the consumption of microplastics. Moving on, wool. Wool is derived from a renewable resource like most non-synthetic yarns. Ethical wool farming practices do require quite a bit of land, which can lead to overgrazing and land degradation, which is basically when you're stripping the resources from the land to the point where you can no longer grow crops on it, and the soil is considered dead. and it takes a lot of work to revive like dead land. Wool farming in general is a water intensive process and also energy intensive. You can't throw around umbrella statements like synthetic yarn is bad for the environment without considering all yarns are bad for the environment. So wool farming can also cause water pollution in nearby water tables close to where the sheep are being farmed. Sheep produce methane. And on the processing side of things, wool, much like human hair, gets oily and greasy, and it requires chemical degreasers and solvents in the processing that contributes to pollution. Superwash wool, as far as sustainability goes, it's a combination of synthetic and wool yarn. It's the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. Superwash wool is made with wool fibers that have been chemically treated to coat each fiber with a polymer resin. Taylor Earl from Wool Needles Hands has an excellent video diving into superwash wool, and I would highly recommend it. I'm going to go ahead and link it in the description below so you can reference that too. And then with superwash wool, basically all the scary things that I said about wool and all the scary things I said about synthetic yarn applies to superwash wool. Recycled synthetic yarn or recycled plastic yarn, on the bright side, is repurposing raw materials. However, it does still require energy to produce. It's also not guaranteed that the yarn is what you think it is. So what I mean by that is companies can call something recycled when it's really just scrap from their processing. So if you think about like a company that makes chocolate bars and they ruin a couple, well, it may not be entirely ruined. They can break off part of that chocolate, throw it back into the melting section of the factory with the melted chocolate and form it into a new bar. That's not really recycling because it didn't go out to a customer and then get recycled into new chocolate. They're just using up scraps from the factory. So that's called post-industrial recycled content. Post-consumer recycled content is content that has gone to a consumer, been used, and then recycled into something new or the same product. And there usually isn't any differentiation written on material labels, so consumers don't get to know which one it is. So with industrial recycled content, I don't want to hate on it because yeah, it's so much better than just throwing the scrap away. But companies aren't doing it to save the rainforest, they're doing it to save money. It's just good business, not to waste perfectly fine raw material. And good news in general with recycled content in yarn is something was saved from going to the landfill, at least temporarily, which is generally a good thing. Bamboo is a very fast growing plant, which means that it's renewable but also efficient, which I respect. However, the processing of bamboo and growing and everything, it still requires chemicals and water and energy to produce it and get from the state of being little bamboo seedlings to bamboo usable yarn. Cotton yarn is not as fast growing as bamboo, but it is still a natural fiber from a plant source. The cotton plant is actually pretty vulnerable and usually requires quite a bit of pesticides, which is harmful on the ecosystem surrounding those farming locations. Typically something labeled organic, whether it be cotton or bamboo or whatever, you can assume that minimal pesticides or no pesticides at all were used in the processing of that yarn. Alpaca yarn, I'm kind of jumping all over the place with these yarns. They're not in any particular order. And I kind of did that on purpose because I didn't want to make it seem like any one yarn was better than another. That's a conclusion I want people to come to on their own and not forming opinions just based on mine. Alpaca yarn. So alpaca farming is actually considered generally better for the environment than wool farming. Alpacas typically eat a wider variety of plants, and typically when they're eating, they don't disturb the root system of the plant that they're eating, which helps to prevent that land degradation that we can see with sheep farming. They also generally don't require as much food and water as sheep when you take into account the amount of wool being produced by the individual animal. Still, alpaca farming uses, let's say it together, energy and water. No one saw that one coming. So linen fibers actually come from the flax plant, and I almost wish they would call it flax. Like all the non-synthetic fibers that I've listed so far, it is biodegradable. And then in general, flax farming typically has a smaller environmental impact than cotton farming does. Hemp, every stoner's favorite material. For legal reasons, that was a joke. Hemp is fast growing. You can think kind of like bamboo. It doesn't require as many pesticides as cotton does generally. And between farming and processing, it actually uses fewer resources, again, typically, than cotton does or even flax. So its environmental impact is a little bit more minimal. So when yarns are blended as a synthetic fiber and a natural fiber, you can generally just assume that it's going to be the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. It's also really tricky when it reaches the end of its lifespan because it's mixed materials, and a good rule of thumb to know is mixed materials are not easy to recycle. Recycling, in most cases, requires the easy ability to separate materials so that you can have like materials with like materials. There are some chemical recycling technologies that are growing, but I don't think they're really to the point where they can handle separating natural fibers from synthetic fibers. And on top of that, chemical recycling as a process is really expensive and not a lot of places do it. At least not as much as mechanical recycling. So you can assume when you put recycling onto the curb, most of the time it's going through a mechanical recycling process. So hopefully the takeaway from me listing all those yarns is, wow, all yarn kind of sucks for the environment, because that's the point. They all kind of suck a little bit. For anybody that does want to be looking for more sustainable fibers and that's something you want to use more, I do have a couple things that you can look for. And comment section, again, this is another opportunity for you to sound off if you have recommendations or tips around these things. And the intention is not to shame people who don't shop with all of these things in mind. It's just, if you are someone who has the capability and interest in shopping with this certain value in mind, here are some things that you can do to help with that. You can always look to see if materials have certifications. So there are lots of different certifications out there. And there are a couple other certifications that'll kind of pop up on the screen. And if you want to be like really extra, you can also look up when yarns list that they have a certain certification. You can look up that certification and see where it comes from, because what is ideal is certifications that are coming from a third-party source, which essentially means it is a company or organization that has nothing to do with the companies it's certifying. They have no stake in the game when it comes to saying yes, they're certified, or no, they are not. At least that's the hope. And like I said, there are tons of certifications out there, and with sustainability being on people's minds a lot more lately, there are always new certification boards popping up. So again, if you're ever curious, just when you see one, look it up. It takes 10 seconds. Now, while we are on the topic of sustainability, I would love to talk about the green elephant in the room: greenwashing. Greenwashing was heavily talked about at both my high school and my university and my current job. And it's stressful because the intention is to trick you. So I'm just gonna cover some little, this is what greenwashing techniques are being used. Greenwashing in general is the practice of a company trying to make themselves sound more sustainable than they really are. At its best, they're just being dramatic or using tricky wording to make it sound like they're really awesome. And at its worst, they're straight up lying about what they do. And greenwashing can manifest in several ways. One of those is vague terminology. There are no regulations preventing a company from claiming that their material is green or eco-friendly or sustainable. Anyone can slap that on a label, and it doesn't have to be true. Genuinely eco-friendly brands are really transparent about what makes them eco-friendly or sustainable. Companies love to brag about their sustainability processes. They are huge narcissists. There are no companies that are out there sneaking around being sustainable in the shadows where no one can see them. If a company is doing sustainable practices, they will let you know. They will make it painfully obvious. And they will brag about every little detail, which is why when companies give you a lot of detail about their current practices and their goals, I also fully love brands that aren't there yet with sustainability, and they're open about that, and they're like, hey, here's our plan, here's where we're currently at, this is what we're gonna do, and here's our goal. We'll see if we meet it. There's value in that as well. Another form of greenwashing that I touched on earlier is unsubstantiated certifications. So like I said, look for those third-party certifications. You can generally look up the name of the certification and then just write in third-party ? In Google and find an answer pretty quickly. It's not uncommon for companies to create their own certification boards, give it a different name, or have it be a subdivision of their company, give it a different name to make it look like someone else is saying, hey, look what a great job they're doing, when they're really just saying that about themselves. And that's the danger in not having third-party certifications. A gray area within greenwashing is selective highlighting. So some companies will be like, hey, we are so good at this one very specific thing, and they won't talk about anything else. And they'll be like, don't look over there. Don't think about that stuff. We're really good at this one thing that we're talking about. So it's great that they're doing good at that one thing, but a lot of times they're covering up or trying to cover up like a million other terrible things that they're doing. And this isn't necessarily greenwashing, but I would say a red flag to me with brands and companies is companies that have no clear commitment to improve. I like to see companies that have long-term goals and they're open and public about those long-term goals. Genuinely eco-friendly companies are transparent about their journey and ongoing efforts and desire to continuously improve. That wraps up the sustainability section. You're doing great. You're hanging in there with this video. It's a lot. It's a lot of information to take in. Or for some of you, you're like, I already knew all of that. Good. That's great. We love it. There's like almost nothing in this cup anyways. I don't know why I'm still holding it. There's some comfort, I think, in holding a cup. Yeah, I feel more comfortable. It's a comfort. I'm just gonna keep holding this. So this next category is ethical labor and farming practices. I am going to group together in this category animal and human rights, but I'll be discussing them separately. So for ethical labor practices, we're talking about the ethical treatment of the people who work to produce these materials that we're using. And a lot of what I'm going to touch on is not specific to yarn. It applies to all items we consume in general for the most part. A lot of these things are also pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to dive too deep into any one of them. And I also don't think that there are a lot of people that are going to disagree with the importance of ethical labor practices. People's issue or holdup usually with it is price points. And again, because it's not that controversial to think that humans deserve rights. Even saying that got some people heated. Like, did you get a little bit triggered when I said that? Low wages. So workers are at risk of receiving treatment where they are receiving low wages. And in the worst cases, it is a step above slavery, or honestly, in some cases, straight up slavery. Unsafe working conditions. So some yarn production facilities lack proper safety measures. The issue is that this can lead to long-term health issues that take someone out of the workforce entirely. Long hours and overtime, employees could be required to be working excessively long hours and frequent overtime without proper compensation. I know a lot of people in the United States working even 9 to 5s can relate to this, 9 to 5s. A lack of workers' rights. A lot of workers can face challenges in exercising their rights, and in some cases they haven't received any education on what their rights are. They don't know what questions to be asking. So a lot of these rights violations can include prevention of the freedom to join certain labor unions, negotiate for better working conditions, a lack of job security, and fear of retaliation for speaking out. These can all be significant obstacles. There are even companies, and many of them, that will take their employees' passports and hold them as collateral for their employees' loyalty. Child labor. There are instances in the use of child labor in yarn production, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to know who's doing it. Child labor goes against international labor standards, and it's a lot sneakier than most people think. The complexity of global supply chains can make it incredibly challenging to trace the origin of certain materials and ensure that fair treatment of workers has been done at every step of the process. And these exploitative practices can happen at any point in the supply chain. It can happen on the farms where wool is being produced. It can happen with the people that are shearing the sheep, the people washing the wool, forming it into yarn, shipping that yarn off in the distribution system and selling it, any stage. And so it's incredibly difficult to know that the yarn I got in every single hand it touched was met with someone who has experienced ethical treatment at their place of work. It can be so overwhelming to even imagine that. Discrimination and harassment, I say with a smile. And again, this is the kind of thing that companies can't really get certified for. There's no certification for like, congratulations, no racist comments in this office in 90 days, or good job, 0 microaggressions detected at this company. Like, there's no stickers for that. So it's hard for us to know as consumers. So these issues are kind of tough because, again, it's a lot of things that people agree on, but struggle to know, like, how do I actually support any of this? So it's really the responsibility of the organization to be seeking out ethical treatment of their workers. And for those that are interested and have the ability to, there are ways to support or identify ethical brands. So one is, when you come across a brand, do a quick little research on what their values are. If you Google the company's names and their values, ethical brands are usually pretty good about providing clear information about what their ethical practices are. And similar to sustainability, it's the kind of thing that companies love to brag about. So if they're doing it, they're probably being pretty vocal about it. Another way you can kind of know how ethical a company is, if they're not really sharing that anywhere, is if they have any sort of sustainability initiative. So sustainability and ethical labor practices tend to go hand in hand. And so if you see a company doing one, you can generally assume that they're working towards both, at least on a minimal level. Are they involved in the community that they work in? What do they do? What are they doing? For people that want bonus points, you can contact the brands directly. Most places have a way that you can contact them, and ethical brands love to brag again, so they're usually up for the conversation or your questions. And it's always interesting to see what kind of legal babble they send back. And then another thing that can be kind of tricky, but also is very helpful, is geography. Looking at the label, seeing where it was made, a lot of regions are known for having unfortunate labor practices and poor treatment of their workers, and either not having good regulations in place or not enforcing them if they do have them in place. When you look at that, you can do a quick Google search of whatever that country is that's on the label, and then typing in ethical practices ? And seeing if there's a generalized yay or nay. A note on this topic in general is you really don't have to be doing hours and hours of research. A lot of this can sound so overwhelming. I recommend, if you are interested in this topic in general or any of this stuff, picking 1 or 2 habits to do. Don't hold yourself to the standard of having to do everything perfectly, because that's just not sustainable. Do a quick 20-second Google search when you are faced with a new yarn brand, because a lot of times we're buying from the same yarn brand, so it's not like you're doing this all the time. This outfit is not great for sitting down in because it's got like a long shirt tail, and the pants are it's just not a good sitting down outfit. I might change after this topic, we'll see. So as far as the ethical treatment of animals goes, let's dive into that queasy topic. If you have a hard time hearing about this kind of stuff, maybe just skip ahead to the next chapter in the video. I put little chapter buttons in there, so you should be able to just skip right ahead. So there are a few pretty common ways that animals can be mistreated in the farming practices, and I'll talk about some of the sketchy things. Overcrowding is a very common issue in factory farming, where animals are just squeezed together for their entire lifespan. These animals never get to see the sky, and it can be pretty rough in there. That one's pretty self-explanatory. There are concerns about inhumane and lazy shearing techniques. One of the major issues around shearing is that workers are typically paid per animal instead of per hour, and so they're incentivized to work as quickly as possible, which can lead to cutting corners that leads to increased safety and increasing maybe how comfortable the animal is. I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways, but I'm gonna say mulesing. It's a controversial practice involving the removal of strips of skin from the rear end of a sheep. The goal is that it'll prevent fly strike, and fly strike is a painful and occasionally fatal condition where flies are laying their eggs on an animal. These eggs hatch into maggots, which will eat the flesh of the host they are on. The obvious criticism around this practice is there's likely not a lot of anesthesia going on in this skin removal process. And most recent research actually suggests that this practice isn't as effective as people once thought it was. And so we're actually seeing a pretty significant decline in it because it doesn't make sense as a farmer to put in the extra effort of doing this practice only for it to do nothing. Like, that's a waste of your energy. So if they don't have to do it, they probably won't do it. And then on top of that, there's just general animal abuse, which involves intentionally or passively harming an animal in a variety and spectrum of ways that I would like to not discuss. You can look up on your own videos about animal abuse and have fun with the images in there. If animal rights is your jam and that's something that you want to be supporting with your yarn purchases, there are certifications that you can look for. And then you can also find brands that are really open about their farming practices. Okay, that's it for the two heaviest categories. The rest are a bit more controversial because most people agree that sustainability and ethics are things to be supported, and the only issue that stands in the way is having the money to be able to support those issues. But some of the remaining topics I'm going to talk about tend to be a lot more controversial, especially lately on social media. The other outfit was comfy for walks, super comfy, not for sitting down. I need stretchier, looser clothes for that. Yarn stash. This is the biggest debate for some reason. And I feel like both sides just need to take a second and think about the other side. Granted, I feel like most individuals fall somewhere in the spectrum of I don't care, people can do whatever they want. There are just a couple loud people in both camps screaming at each other and we're all just sitting in the middle what's going on? So the two ends of this spectrum usually range from I only ever buy yarn for one project at a time and use up that yarn, and only then can I buy more, to people that actively collect yarn. And I think the thing that's missed is this isn't about what most people think it's about. It's more about how people experience and enjoy their craft, what makes it more enjoyable for them, and what makes them better at their craft. And I think a lot of people narrow it down to a single issue. So I'm going to explain both sides and advocate for each of them a little bit here. So on the minimalist side, there are a lot of reasons why someone wants to have a really small and curated yarn stash. Some of the more common reasons that people cite is a general sense of overwhelm when faced with having a really large stash. It can be really stressful to look at that and think, oh my gosh, how am I possibly going to use up all of this yarn? Some people have a value of just being a more minimalistic consumer and may lean more anti-capitalist, minimalist, conscious consumer in that camp, and straight up just have a moral objection to the overconsumption of goods in general, plain and simple. Some people with their craft are just more focused on individual projects, and that's how they best enjoy the craft, is just one project at a time. Because flexibility and spontaneity isn't the way for everybody. For some people, it's an issue of lack of storage space. There's no place to put it. Yarn takes up a lot of room when your stash gets big enough and there's just nowhere to put it. Another big reason why some people choose to have a smaller stash and value having a smaller stash is the amount of money and privilege that comes with having a really large yarn stash. So on the collector side of things, and from the collector's perspective, a big reason cited for having a large stash is the amount of inspiration that can come from that. Fiber art is art, and I feel like an artist, a drawing artist, wouldn't get a lot of hate for owning 10,000 different colored pencils if they were a specific colored pencil artist. So I feel like it's unproportional disproportionate, I don't know. It's not proportional, the amount of hate that I think fiber artists get for having a large yarn stash when it's just the medium of this art and it takes up a lot of space. It's not compact like a marker. And along that trend of inspiration, for a lot of people, a lot of these fiber artists, looking at their stash and going through it and just touching the different yarns, seeing it, is such a major source of inspiration, and that's how they get their ideas. It's how they get excited about their craft. For some people, having a large stash is about flexibility. They're never going to be the kind of person that can plan out a project and say, okay, I'm going to sit and do this, when it's way more mood-based what project they want to work on. And for some people, it's a lot more personal. There's an emotional connection to having yarn. I think yarn itself is precious, and that can be the end result. And for some people, it's how they remember certain vacations or memories or people in their lives if it was gifted to them. It's more than just a ball of yarn. I don't want to hear from anybody that one group gets more hate than the other. From what I've seen on the internet, both groups get a ton of hate from the other. There is hate on both ends. Of course, with the caveat that hoarding is a real thing and is not beneficial. So there is a difference, I think, between having a large stash and just straight up hoarding and being an overconsumer. But where that line is so contextual that I can't make any generalizations for the sake of this video. Hi, baby. Hi. Local sourcing. It's what people are talking about when they say shop local. Some people don't actually know why shopping local is important, but they know that it is. And there's no shame in that. So the reason why shopping local is generally encouraged is because it supports the local economy, your local economy. It reduces environmental impact, and because you are not shipping something in an airplane that uses so much fossil fuels to get from one place to another, shipping your yarn. And generally there's a lot less packaging involved in local shipping compared to something that was shipped on an airplane or an ocean freight, where it had to be in a big freight container and then on a pallet, which is wrapped in plastic and plastic straps and whatnot. And within that are boxes that contain more plastic probably, and then the product in there and whatever else packaging they throw in. So when you're shopping local, there's a lot less packaging and distribution involved in that whole process. Shopping local is also good because it enhances the sense of community from a more cultural standpoint. And this benefit tends to be more emotional and psychological than like tangible. And I think the big obstacle in shopping local is just that it's not an accessible option for everybody based on where you live and how much money you make. Local things from major companies that are being made in the cheapest places possible are cheap because they exploit laborers and cut corners and do whatever it takes to reduce the price and make it as cheaply as possible. There's a reason why that's less expensive than something that you can buy local that followed all the rules and regulations and got all the certifications and pays everyone great. That yarn's gonna be a lot more expensive than the other. And not everyone can pay this, which is a major obstacle and brings me into the next point, which is personal finances. But I'm gonna be picking on everybody equally, so it's fair, including myself. I don't do everything I'm talking about. I can't afford to. So the concept of personal finances is pretty straightforward. Most people can't afford to buy yarn that meets all of their ethical and moral values. That stuff expensive. On the flip side, some people think that because they aren't billionaires, it completely absolves them from any sort of responsibility when it comes to being a conscious consumer. This group tends to be the same group that leans a little too hard into the concept of there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. Because yes, I personally think that's true, but that's not justification for why you should do a Shein haul of 20 different t-shirts that are going to disintegrate in a week. Like, the statement there is no ethical consumption under capitalism doesn't justify never even considering the ethical implications of what you're supporting with your dollar. And then you have the people that are really far out of touch and don't understand that not everybody can afford that perfectly ethically made yarn. And let's be real, if we're talking sustainability wise, hemp is one of the most sustainable materials that I mentioned. Not a lot of people want to wear hemp. It's not generally the softest material. And so sometimes even the best yarn for your values isn't the best yarn for your project. And some people love hemp and it depends on the yarn. I don't want to pick on hemp here, but for example, some people are just never going to want to wear that. And so there's no point in making a sweater out of that material. And so anyways, I do think that there are people that are so out of touch and don't understand that stuff costs money. And you can't just tell someone you can't do this hobby because you can't afford to purchase the nicest of everything, because that turns into gatekeeping real quick and really plays into this elitist attitude that some people have. Sorry, there are a lot of opinions involved in that. So on the beneficial side of personal finance, if there are things that people want to do to save money, Again, comment section, speak up. You can even go to the comment section on my Essentials versus Extra video. There were a lot of really great recommendations in there about where to find yarn at a reduced cost, and like usually nice yarn too. Local libraries will often have knitting or crochet pattern books or books about fiber, like more in the world of fiber arts as well, that you can check out. And some libraries even have events or supplies that you can check out, like knitting needles that you can check out from the library. I know my library even has like sewing machines that you can check out. There are a lot of buy nothing groups that you can find. I think Facebook has a lot of buy nothing groups, or you can just Google the name of the city that you're in or nearest to, and then the term like buy nothing group, and see what pops up. These are typically groups where someone will ask for something, or they'll say that they have something. So people will post, hey, I have a bunch of yarn to get rid of if anybody wants it for free. And you can just post like, hey, I'm looking for yarn, and see what people reply with. This really depends on the area that you're in, and it can be done both online and in person, with going to thrift stores and stuff. But finding secondhand yarn in the form of yarn, or as a blanket that you can unravel, or a sweater or another garment that can be unraveled and the yarn can be reused. Doing yarn swaps with friends, if you have any that live in your area. Another option that isn't for everybody is making less or remaking what you've already made. Maybe there's a sweater that doesn't fit quite right, or the collar's too tight. Unravel it, do it again. Or a sweater that was like, okay, that was fun, but I kind of want to make something else, and I don't really wear that. I don't really wear that piece that often anymore. Make it into something new. I have recently started doing that, and I was surprised. I thought I was going to have a harder time unraveling a piece that I put so much effort into, but it feels really good. And with all of these options, again, I just want to hound in how important it is to not hold yourself to the standard of doing all of these things, but maybe if you're interested, picking one or two to do and start implementing, because it's a lot of work to get all of your yarn secondhand. That requires time that not everybody has. But maybe next time you're at a thrift store anyways, check out and see what there is. Like maybe there are sweaters that you want to unravel. There's a YouTube channel called Go Gently, and a book written by Bonnie Wright. You might know her from Harry Potter. She played Ginny Weasley. She has an amazing YouTube channel and book where she talks about this concept of, and she does it through the lens of sustainability, but the importance of moving gently through sustainability, where don't hold yourself to the highest standard of always having to compost everything and always spending your weekends picking up trash on the side of the highway and never using toilet paper. Like you don't have to hold yourself to the standard, because that's how people get really overwhelmed, burn out, and then stop trying altogether. It's way better for everyone to just do a little bit. Anyways, I highly recommend her YouTube channel. It's very chill and relaxed and makes me feel way better about the future. And then also remembering, just because something's expensive doesn't mean it's good. All right, elitism and accessibility. This category is kind of a little bit all over the place because those terms have such a wide range of definitions to them. So I'll just pick apart each one, starting with elitism. So outside of the world of yarn itself, there is elitism in the craft of crochet and knitting. Weirdly enough, there's certain perceptions around yarn choice that I think lend themselves to being elitist. Like yarn weight, for example. Bulky yarn has had its moment in the sun for the past couple of years. It's been extremely trendy and a lot of people are loving it. And because of that, there are also a lot of haters and people who think that they are better just because they use only fingering weight yarn. And then we just end up with this wild discourse between people who prefer bulky yarn versus people who prefer lighter weight yarns. Does it matter? If they like it and they're enjoying using the material that they're using, leave them alone. And then there's hate on people who use the smaller weight yarns because they can't produce stuff as quickly. So it's a lot slower, and I feel like the internet is less forgiving with slowness at this point. Everything is so instantaneous. So there are issues on both sides. I think this kind of ties in with elitism, but the lack of diversity in knitting and crochet is wild. Let's be honest, it's mostly white women. And I'm not just talking about racial diversity either. I'm also talking about gender diversity and religion and all all the categories, because I feel like I'm only seeing one type of person on the internet as like an influencer or content creator or whatever. Like, it's a lot of people that are at the same financial level, have the same family status, have the same perspective. Like, it's more interesting to see people from different backgrounds, whether that be race or ethnicity. It's just more interesting when you have a more diverse range of perspectives playing into this craft. But I think that's where some of the fear lies, is like, oh no, I'm a white woman. What does this mean? That I can't post on the internet anymore? No, it just means that we should also be uplifting creators who fall outside of the standard. So personally, as far as YouTube channels go, I love YouTube, obviously. I watch a lot of crochet and knitting content on YouTube. It's some of my favorite. And I'm always looking for recommendations. And I would love to have a more diverse range of creators showing up in my feed. And I just don't know where to go looking. So if anyone has any recommendations, let me know. Some of the POC channels that I really enjoy right now is Teal Yarn Crafts with Tony Lipsy. Dr. Charlie Untangled, right now she's a really small channel and deserves a lot more views and attention. Marissa of Marissa Made just has such a great personality. She just makes you feel good watching her videos. Tiffany Lou, great streaming, and is just incredibly passionate about knitting and crochet as well. And then crafty channels like outside of knitting and crochet, I also really like Wendy from With Wendy and Valerie Lynn. So if anybody has any recommendations for channels that they like with diverse creators, I would like to see more men, more people of color, and just different people with different experiences that are willing to let me into their world a little bit and give me their perspective, because I would love to hear it. Now, I would dive in more into the conversation of people of color in knitting and representation in knitting and crochet and fiber arts in general, but people do not need me being the voice or attempting to be the voice of people of color, because that's just not fair to them. So I would highly, highly recommend that you check out a video essay from the channel All Homesteading, and it's called BIPOC Representation in Knitting, where she dives more into this topic. Incredibly fascinating, and I appreciate how they talk about why it matters. And I think some people who aren't people of color, speaking as a white woman, have difficulty relating to why it's important. So I think something a lot of women in general can relate to is the unsettling feeling of being the only woman in a room. Like, the men in the room don't have to be doing anything sketchy for me to be uncomfortable. It's just naturally going to be unsettling being the only woman in a room full of men. So again, I don't want to speak for people of color here, but I imagine there's a similar feeling to being the only Black person at a fiber festival. And there's always something to be said for seeing people with similar experiences to you doing something that you want to do, because it helps give you that courage to feel like you could do it too. And that's another reason why, again, representation matters. That's diversity. I really just went off in that section. Okay, the last category is accessibility. It's complicated because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I'm gonna try to cover accessibility from a couple different standpoints. So some accessibility issues that can exist with yarn is some people have allergies to either wool or chemicals being used in certain processes. There are commonly allergies related to certain dyes. And so that's why someone might not want to go with a hand-dyed yarn brand that isn't open about what type of dyes they use, because they might not be able to trust it because they're straight up risking allergic reactions. People with vision impairments might need color contrasting yarn. For a lot of people with mobility issues, having a thicker yarn is the only way that this craft is accessible for them. Some are limited by the form that the yarn comes in when they buy it and need to buy something that has a center pull because they have mobility issues that make it difficult to deal with any other form factor that yarn can come in. People who have sensory issues that can stem from anything, including like autism, they can have sensory sensitivity and really easily overstimulated by the sensation of certain yarns or yarn weights. And so they're just limited in what they can use because of that. There's accessibility in the sense of geography, where not everyone has access to the same stuff, and not all fibers are available for all people. This is an opportunity for anybody with some sort of accessibility consideration involved in yarn. Speak up, please. I would love to hear more, because I know I have not heard every perspective on this. There's so many different accessibility considerations specifically relating to yarn that I haven't even thought of, because I don't have to deal with them. So I would love to learn, please. Oh, and I think the big accessibility issue for a lot of people is money. Yarn costs money. People want to buy things that fit their values, because why wouldn't you? And the biggest barrier is usually financial. Whew. Okay, deep breath. That was a lot. That was a big conversation. So my opinion really isn't the point for most of this video, but there is one opinion of mine that I think belongs here. Leave people the alone. You don't know why someone is using the yarn that they're using. There will be a time, if you subscribe to me and watch my videos, where I'm going to use a yarn that doesn't align to your values or mine, and you don't know why I'm using that yarn. And usually it's more than one reason, and it's a lot more complicated than just why is she using that yarn. So, like, lay off of others, please. That's my high horse, and some of y'all needed to hear that and some of you didn't. And some people who needed to hear it might just need to hear it from the perspective of like, hey, I feel guilty. I think a lot of people can relate to this, feeling guilty about the type of yarn that you buy because of your limitations, many of which are totally out of your own control. So some people, I think, need to hear that it's okay. It's okay that you're using whatever yarn you're using, because only you know what the perfect combination and balance is between your values, your limitations, and the requirements of the project you're doing as well. Some yarns are just better for some things. One more caveat to just throw into all of this is not all yarns are made equal. Not all acrylic yarns are made equal. Some are made incredibly responsibly at a high quality, and not all wool is made equal. Some is coming from farms where they heavily abuse their animals and do not follow any sort of sustainability regulations and are incredibly irresponsible in their supply chain. So don't make the incorrect assumption that a yarn is better than another, because it's so much more complicated than that. That was it. This is not the normal type of video I make. I usually do more like chatty, lighter, fluffier vlog things, but this was just something that I'm interested in and really wanted to talk about, and I wanted to get other people's opinions, including yours. So yeah, that's what this is. And that's the video. That's all I got. I've been doing this for like 3.5 hours now. I kind of want a snack. Some people are gonna hate this video. Look at my cats. They're so cute. This is Mary. Hi, Mary. I'd feel bad about waking her up, but she wakes me up at 3 a.m. every day. So you know what? It goes both ways, girl. And here is my baby, Pippin. She's me if I was a cat, chunky and resting. She is also a lover of yarn.